Good evening, everybody. How are we doing tonight? Good. We're so glad that you decided to spend your Thursday evening with us. I'm David DeSerto. I'm the interim executive director here at the Sheen Center. And this is our final author night of the fall season. As they say, we save the best for last. We're so grateful for Randy and Rusty to be with us this evening. And for those of you who have been to the Sheen Center before, welcome back. For those who are the first time, welcome. The Sheen Center obviously is a project initiative of the Archdiocese of New York. And as a Catholic Arts Center, it's really more than bricks and mortar. It's about an idea. It's about engaging the culture through the arts, through beauty, and as in this evening, through thoughtful discourse. In essence, to be a voice in the public square. And probably no one did that better than our namesake Fulton Sheen and the subject of tonight, Father Richard John Neuhaus. As Cardinal Dolan said on the jacket in the back, it says, faith is it is correctly observed, while intensely personal, it is never private. In North America, nobody was seemingly more effective in defending and encouraging bringing religion into the public square than Richard John Neuhaus. Now, I have to say, this event tonight is meaningful to me on multiple levels, but in specifically because when we opened the Sheen Center probably about 5 years ago, we originally had invited Randy to come and speak about his book. And as fate would have it, about several weeks before the event, we had a major problem with our ceiling. We had to rip our ceiling out. So we were unable to follow through with that event. And I've just been so desiring to reschedule that. I really wanted Randy here. And I'm so glad that even though it took 5 years, we were able to make good on that. So without further ado, well, let me just tell you a little bit about the format. Randy will come up, speak for a while, then we're going to invite Randy and Rusty Reno from First Things to have a moderated conversation, and then we will open the floor to audience questions. So while they're talking, start thinking about those questions, and we'll have a nice conversation. So now, without further ado, please join me in warmly welcoming to the stage Mr. Randy Boyagoda.
Thank you very much, David. The church thinks in centuries, so 5 years is really just a heartbeat when you think about it. I want to begin. I flew in this afternoon from Toronto, and I want to begin by thanking all of you for the occasion of getting to spend this time here. Last week, my wife and our 4 daughters got a 10-week-old Weimaraner puppy, which means that we have an hourly potty training experience going on in our house, and I'm not there right now. So thank you so much for that. I think what I would do this evening is I want to read to you a little bit from the book itself, just to give you a sense of, in particular, how important New York and a vocation to urban ministry was to the life and work of Richard John Neuhaus. So I'm going to kind of begin that way. There's one scene in particular that I want to tell you about. I'll say a little bit in more general terms, I think, about that vocation, how he came to it, and then in terms of how he lived it out and what it means for us today, I think that would make a lot more sense to have a conversation with Rusty about that. So let me begin then by reading a little bit from the book. There was smoke and ash and great singing in the church that night in 1967. The pews were filled with left-wing radicals and their marijuana and cigarettes. They had come over from Manhattan to a broken-down corner of Brooklyn, along with some television cameras and reporters for a, quote, service of conscience and hope, an event that yoked prayer and protest over the grave injustice of the U.S. war effort in Vietnam. During its signal moment, some 200 young men solemnly walked to the altar bearing their draft cards, which they deposited in a bowl. This was their symbolic and efficacious means of refusing to join the American war machine. Following the service, the cards would be sent on to the Justice Department. The young men walked forward amid much 60s-era atmospherics, but the church was far from silent. The long-haired people on the scored wooden benches were singing with everything they had. But this time they were not running through one of their standard angry protest chants or cooing the latest soft-melt folk pain to peace. They were singing America the Beautiful, following the deep-voiced man of God presiding over the service, 31-year-old Richard John Neuhaus. He was pastor at St. John the Evangelist, the thriving Lutheran church hosting the event. He was also one of the founders of a leading anti-war group, clergy and laity concerned about Vietnam, and a fast-rising intellectual and activist on the American left. But this trajectory would never be finally or fully his trajectory. The song he wanted his fellow anti-war activists to sing at St. John the Evangelist indicated as much. As he would later recount, his suggestion was met with silence, even shock. Asking this particular gathering to sing that particular song was basically like asking Billy Graham and Bob Hope to sing communist anthems at an Honor America rally. Neuhaus, however, was convinced prayer and protest could be joined to patriotism. In fact, at difficult and fraught times in American public life, they had to be, whether to rescue love of country from war-making scoundrels and other ugly conservatives, or to remind myopic pacifists and other sweet, dreamy liberals that they were citizens called by God and by history to love and help redeem their troubled nation, not hate it and abandon it to its hateful elements. And so this was why, as far as Neuhaus was concerned, nothing less than America the Beautiful had to sound forth in the church while all the young men said no to what their country was doing in Vietnam. Pastor Neuhaus preached to the hazy protesters in the hazy pews that the song did not describe the United States as it was. He told them it described the United States they all hoped for, the nation they hoped would come into existence because of the very acts of conscientious objection that they were committing together in the church that night. Provocative, contrarian, challenging, persuasive, Neuhaus won them over. What came of it, as a New York TV news audience and newspaper readers learned the next day, and as he would observe in one of his many books, was, quote, the lustiest and most heartfelt rendition of America the Beautiful I have ever heard. Almost 30 years later, amid all the cheering and applause, it was everything Father Richard John Neuhaus could do to stop his admiring audience from belting out songs like America the Beautiful. He was in Washington to speak at the annual Road to Victory convention in September 1994, 2 months before the midterm elections. The event was sponsored by the Christian Coalition, a political operation dedicated to securing conservative Christian voters for the Republican Party by persuading them to put their electoral trust in the GOP. The 3,000 in attendance were certainly open to their proposition. As far as many conservative Christians in America were concerned, their beloved and God-blessed nation was now run by godless, decadent liberals and, unsurprisingly, going to hell. Public schools taught lefty nonsense and anti-American garbage in place of sound values and strong traditions. Popular culture was a cess-encrusted cesspool. You could abort your unborn child and claim it as a constitutional right more easily than you could quote the Bible at a public meeting or put up a creche at City Hall. Something had to be done about all of this, and if you were a delegate at a Christian Coalition conference, that something was to get the right kind of people elected, Republicans. The coming election, however, would not be easy. The attendees needed encouragement, blessings even, for their effort to turn out fellow churchgoers on Election Day. And who better to do it than the author of the national bestseller, The Naked Public Square, Religion and Democracy in America? Who better than Father Richard John Neuhaus to praise and inspire the God and GOP-loving crowd? He did not deliver the goods they might have been expecting. Instead, he warned his audience, quote, "We can confuse our Christian hope with political success." Further, that there is a danger that we confuse our policy judgments with the judgments of God. And the crowd went wild. It went wild to his dismay, as he would observe in one of his magazine columns. Here he was, challenging his listeners to recognize that the call to faith could not be collapsed into an election campaign, that the dictates of the Bible were far greater than any party platform. Yet they were not really listening to his words, they were merely enthusiastically responding to his presence. After all, this was the famously fearsome Father Neuhaus, culture warrior extraordinaire, neoconservative Catholic priest and editor-in-chief of First Things magazine, the heroic and hilarious blade-sharp scourge of silly and soft liberals inside the churches and most everywhere else. But as much as Neuhaus enjoyed the stab and spike vitalities of professional opinion-making, and indeed he enjoyed these, carrying out his vocation as a priest was more important than burnishing his profile as a punchy public intellectual. That was why, that September 1994 day in Washington, he challenged his convention audience to put not their trust in princes, Republican or otherwise. Following his remarks, one of his listeners approached him, someone who had in fact heard what Neuhaus had said and was upset by it. As Neuhaus recalled, the man was holding back tears as he confronted the very priest and commentator whose writings had inspired him to become involved as a Christian in political activity. The same priest and commentator who was now telling him to take great care as a Christian involved in politics. As he would later observe, Christian political engagement is an endlessly difficult subject. Our Lord said to render to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's, but he did not accommodate us by spelling out the details. Over 2,000 years, Christians have again and again thought they got the mix just right, only to have it blow up in their faces, and not so incidentally in the faces of others. We're always having to go back to the drawing board, which is to say, to first things. Especially when we are most intensely engaged in the battle, first things must be kept in mind. He was very good at product placement. It is not easy, but it is imperative. It profits us nothing, Neuhaus wrote, if we win all the political battles while losing our own souls. Richard John Neuhaus's life and work attest to the endless difficulties, battles, and necessarily imperfect victories of Christian political engagement in modern American culture and politics, whether as a leading clergyman of the American left in the 1960s and 70s, or as the most prominent clergyman of the American right from the 1980s through to his death in 2009. If Neuhaus always understood himself foremost as a man of God, he was regarded by colleagues, collaborators, critics, friends, congregations, parishes, and the national media as a theologian, an activist, an intellectual, an ecumenist, a writer, an editor, a cultural commentator, a political pundit, a political candidate, a policy expert, a religious journalist, a religious leader, a spiritual director, a spiritual father, a teacher, a pastor, a maker of bad coffee, and a priest. This multiplicity corresponds to the array of efforts Neuhaus made over decades and in any number of contexts to bring Judeo-Christian concepts of human dignity, worth, and purpose to bear on every dimension of American public life. For all that he attempted and accomplished, Neuhaus was admired and scorned, closely followed and intensely opposed, and never but taken seriously. Late nights. At his apartment on East 19th Street in Lower Manhattan. After dinner and evening prayer, Neuhaus liked to sit and hold forth, his Roman collar loosed, an old plaid shirt keeping him warm, a Baccarat cigar in one hand and a glass of old Weller bourbon in the other, his eyes twinkling and his mouth set to that lifelong wry grin. Bach would be playing on the stereo, and his dog, whether Sammy or his successor, Sammy too, would be sleeping by the fireplace. And when Neuhaus was finally done with his authoritative statements on this and that and everything else that was right and wrong about American Christianity, when he had stopped telling great stories of his Canadian boyhood and his hell-raising days as a young man, when he had finished recounting his cherished times on the march with Martin Luther King and his meeting in the Oval Office with this president and dining in the papal apartment with that pope, Neuhaus would turn his attention to the very first of first things. He would tell his friends that all his life he wanted to do something beautiful for God. This biography that I've written is the story of all that he tried and all that he did. This is a story that begins in the 1930s in a place called Pembroke, Ontario, a small town out of Ottawa, where Neuhaus was born to a Lutheran pastor and grew up there. From there, he moved to Texas for minor seminary and 2 years of college. He famously liked to note that he never graduated high school. He just walked right up to the college line at college and talked his way in, basically, and was successfully admitted. From there, he went to St. Louis, to Concordia Seminary, a then thriving seminary of the Missouri Synod. And from there, he really launched into his full vocation as a pastor. Perhaps the most decisive experience of that was a summer placement that he had in Detroit. And it was in Detroit on a Sunday morning. He was standing on the church steps as a kind of summer intern, welcoming congregants to the service. And he noted that every time a black family came to the steps, one of the other ushers would go down and give the person money. And it was cab fare to go to a black church. And that for Neuhaus was a decisive moment in terms of his vocation to urban ministry and his commitment to civil rights. It happened in that very moment. He returned eventually to St. Louis, where he was assigned, given, I think, in many ways, his outsized personality and not inconsiderable ambition, to a parish in Messina, New York, population negative 12, more or less. And I think it was perceived to be a way of getting him to kind of right-size his ambitions. He spent about a year there. Very little is known about that year there. But then he answered a call, as is put in the Lutheran Confession, to St. John the Evangelist in Brooklyn, a church that was more or less had seen what would be perceived to see more or less its dying days, insofar as it participated in what we've now called, in sociological terms, white flight. That changes economically and racially to American inner cities resulted in long-time, predominantly white ethnic groups leaving for the suburbs. And so this had happened to a German-majority Lutheran church in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. The pastor and the majority of the congregation basically decamped for Long Island, if I'm not mistaken, taking the church charter with them, which is, I think, a pretty big statement. So Neuhaus went there and immediately fell in love, I guess you could say, with the opportunity to renew the place. And that renewal involved, I would say, three very important things, which stayed with him, if you think about his future life and work. One was liturgical orthodoxy, immediately, to take seriously services, to be joyful about it, but also to be very, very serious about what one was called to do in a kind of orthodox way. Immediately, that was important. The second was a personal magnetism that drew around him very quickly a series of young people and church-minded workers who found their vocations, as I learned when I was researching the book, found their vocations to church life through their contact with Neuhaus. And this wasn't simply a youth group or something, but a very structured effort, which involved a daily prayer, which stayed through all the way to his life at 338 East 19th Street. It stayed with him all the way through. So a kind of a community sense of things, which it was a stay against the anonymity of city life in a lot of ways. And then the third thing was public outreach. And that public outreach was as much bread from the store as bread from heaven. In other words, they went into housing projects and elsewhere in a rather impoverished neighborhood, more or less knocking on doors, welcoming people, caring for people who might have been otherwise left behind. And then engage them not only, again, with kind of very practical offerings, but also bringing them to church. The church was renewed this way. At the same time, and that was evident perhaps in the first thing I read for you, Neuhaus began to develop a kind of greater interest in civil rights. He quickly became a national figure in the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement alongside Rabbi Abraham Heschel, leaders in the mainline church, including William Sloane Coffin. He had some contact, as he always very proudly liked to point out, to Martin Luther King. And really, the first segment of his life in New York was spent in Brooklyn, living at St. John the Evangelist. And this really went on until about the mid-'70s. He had a full vocation to his urban ministry, at the same time a vocation of the life of the mind, and then very much a kind of national mindset. He then proceeded into a very different time, I would say, in terms of both his vocation and his life in the city. And I think that's important for us to think about, that his greater vocation and his urban life were very much integrated. From about the mid-'70s until the late 1980s, you could argue that Neuhaus was kind of floating a little bit. He moved through a series of Lutheran affiliations as the Lutheran Church itself kind of went through a slow-motion crack-up, largely over orthodoxy, over the question of biblical inerrancy, among other things. At the same time, Neuhaus was kind of casting about for jobs and outlets for his work. He was still writing prodigiously, but his efforts to find a professional context for his work didn't really work out. They included some work with the Carnegie Fellowship, an effort to take on, some of you may know, St. Peter's, the Lutheran Church in the shadow of the Citibank building. He applied for a position there, and then he basically pitched kind of a faith and ideas type of think tank to go in there. And he wrote and advocated for this intensely, and it didn't work out. It wasn't the right fit. Eventually, he became involved with something called the Rockford Institute out of Illinois, which was a conservative, a more traditional conservative think tank. He became the leader of its New York office. Eventually, he broke with them in a rather big way and made the front page of the New York Times over a sense that Rockford's critiques of rootless cosmopolitanism were basically thinly veiled forms of anti-Semitism. Neuhaus had a long-standing investment and engagement with the Jewish people, with Jewish intellectuals, And so he broke with Rockford over that. By the late 1980s, he was working on what becomes First Things magazine. At the same time, he had more or less intellectually by this point and politically committed very much to the project and the reality of the Catholic Church. And then in August 1990, he converted more formally, again, front page news. This was such a big deal for a lifelong second-generation Lutheran pastor, that his sisters, who lived in Seattle and Florida, flew to Ottawa and then drove 2 hours to be with their mother when she heard the news. And they rushed in the door, and she already had a copy of the Ottawa Citizen, which of course reported this. And they rushed in and they looked at her, and she said, "So, Richard converted." And that was all she ever said about it, apparently. From the 90s onward, we had the Richard John Neuhaus that I suspect most of us in this room know, probably read pretty directly. I'm sure many of you knew him directly, but the life that he had in a religious house, Rusty, 338 East 19th, right? Isn't that the address? 338, yes, 338, which had started in the 70s. Neuhaus and a fellow Lutheran pastor named Father Larry Bailey, who also has a very kind of Greek Orthodox set of interests, basically created a religious house together, lived there in community with others. That continues on in some way, shape, or form through to this day. The house also became a kind of locus for an intellectual life. Friday nights, Henry Kissinger would be over. Norman Podhoretz would be there. There would be a real sense of an intellectual salon around which interns, younger writers, academics, people from all over the world really were invested in visiting with Neuhaus, and that friendship would have been there at the same time that they were also engaging with and contributing to First Things magazine. So that from the 90s onward, New York becomes this very important place for Neuhaus, personally, professionally, just as, even though he spends a lot of time, of course, in Rome, and then likewise in Washington. I'll say one last thing about that. I'll read one final passage, which I think really does speak to the moment where Neuhaus really fell in love with New York. And it's important to think about why this is the moment, I think, that he fell in love with New York. And then I think perhaps Rusty and I can have a fuller conversation. He liked to say that the problem with Washington was that it was a one-company town. There's only one thing ever going on in Washington. Whereas he many times observed in New York, there are worlds upon worlds upon worlds at every street corner. And he found that depth and that pluralism, I think, very, very stimulating. And within that, there were still some really striking moments, difficult moments in many ways. I want to read to you from one of them. Again, let's think about what it means that this is the moment, I think, where he really discovered his love for New York. And I read this really mindful. As I was walking around this beautiful facility, I was really struck by the Sheen Center's next door neighbor. It's Planned Parenthood. And it was one of those moments where I thought, here's one of those moments where I really would love to see a Richard John Neuhaus column. The Sheen Center next door to Planned Parenthood. What would he make of that? But mindful of that, I want to read to you now from this passage. This is a letter that Neuhaus wrote to Robert Louis Wilken, a superb historian of ancient Christianity, longtime at the University of Virginia, longtime involved with First Things magazine, likewise a Lutheran convert to Catholicism. In the in the early 60s, the Lutheran congregation where Neuhaus was, St. John the Evangelist, was so poor they couldn't pay him. There was no money for his salary. So Neuhaus worked as a hospital chaplain to make some income. It was around this, and he had some striking experiences while he was there. And in a private letter to Wilken that Wilken let me read and draw from for this book, he discussed some of his experiences. So I want to read to you from that, and then we'll have this conversation. Neuhaus's time at King's Hospital revealed to him some of the difficulties that surrounded the end of life, violent events, and also life's early moments. Witnessing these difficulties, like a baby boy born unwanted who would become a ward of the city, only intensified his commitment to the ministry he had taken on in becoming an inner-city pastor. This much is evident in a remarkable 21-page letter that Neuhaus wrote Wilken on his breaks during one long day at the hospital. The letter's most revealing moments occur when Neuhaus returns to his pen and paper right after watching this birth. This is Neuhaus now. I just saw baby boy Washington enter life with a cry. He does not yet know how much he will have to cry about. His mother is unmarried and does not want him. He will be turned over to the city for a life of not being wanted. This is true for more than 1/3 of all the hundreds of babies delivered here. I don't think his prospects are very good for finding love, happiness, joy, purpose. I am not depressed, only filled with wonder. Wonder at the glory and tragedy of life in this city. In a little while, I will drive home to Brooklyn and can count on being struck again by the New York skyline, a never-failing object of adoration. The city and the potential of the civilization it represents. To this I am religiously committed, and to the ways of God who brought it into being. What is man that you keep him in mind? Little baby boy Washington, fear not. He has redeemed you. He has called you by the name you do not yet have. You are his. I cannot guarantee you that this is true. It may be a pious illusion, but it is better than what is called truth by men. You are not alone. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy. And now it is also my distinct pleasure to introduce the moderator of this evening, the editor of First Things, Mr. Rusty Reno.
Thank you. All right, Randy, you've given us a nice sort of introduction to Neuhaus. What if we go through and I want to get your thoughts on different aspects of his life. So Neuhaus, the writer, you know, that world within worlds appears on they've installed these little internet portals on the street corners, and often has quotes from various people talking about New York, and that particular quote is featured. And the first time I saw it, I did a double take, thinking, well, whoever is selecting these things for the city of New York
Reads First Things magazine.
Well, has a very Catholic, politically Catholic outlook on things, which is nice. So, what's your sense of him as a writer? A 21-page letter. Yeah. He really had it in him, didn't he?
He did. He wrote for as long as he served in ministry. He had a remarkable capacity as a writer. Any number of books, some personal, as with As I Lay Dying, his reflections on a near-death experience, some very influential and public, and I'm thinking here specifically, of course, of The Naked Public Square, published in 1984. Father Raymond D'Souza has called Neuhaus the original blogger before there were bloggers. That if you think of the back pages, as if you remember it that way, the back pages of First Things, the While We're At It section, that in a sense was a blog before anything else. I would say, before there was one, I would say that Neuhaus was at his best in the 1,000 to 1,500 word range when he was writing on a regular basis in response to the culture and bringing to bear upon the culture a great deal of prayer and reading. I don't think a great deal of his books will sustain any kind of long-time literary appreciation. I think he was far more of a writer of the moment. I say that with a great deal of respect. It's very hard to do that kind of thing. But I think, Rusty, he wrote so much.
Yes, the volume is really quite extraordinary.
It's shocking that within that there are certainly some great moments. But what you really saw, and I think this is true when we read someone like Neuhaus over and over again and develop a relationship to him as a writer through something like First Things magazine, there are phrases, there are premises that return. Mm-hmm. And then you see how they develop and how they deepen and how they shift as the culture shifts and how he sharpens one thing and realizes we don't need to talk about that so much anymore, but this is a new front now for us to consider. I think when Neuhaus was doing that as both a kind of guide for us for engaging the culture and then also as a diagnostician, frankly, of the culture itself, that was when he, as a writer, was at his best.
I mean, he was a great coiner of terms.
Yes, very much.
Naked Public Square being one of them that kind of has entered our lexicon. People
The Catholic moment.
The Catholic moment. People use these phrases in the, quite frequently. Mm-hmm. And as you pointed out, the sheer volume. He did have this newsletter So in the sense that not just the While We're At It section of First Things, but he had was it a weekly newsletter?
Yeah, a
Religion and Public Life or
yes,
something like that?
before First Things
Yes.
magazine. And this was a pseudo-personal, pseudo-public newsletter that went out in parallel to his work while he was at Rockford and to his publishing of Rockford journals. And he used that, actually, that mailing list as a way into First Things, basically. That became kind of an early subscription list. I think we forget about this kind of thing now.
Because it was the precursor of blogging.
Yeah,
You had
exactly.
people who did financial newsletters, and you had people who did, I don't know, sport newsletters or whatever they were. They were a way of getting kind of almost gossip. I think Gil Mylander, one of Neuhaus's, he always admired Gil, and who's also a Missouri Synod pastor. Gil said that that the While We're At It was high-level theological gossip.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. That's a great way to put it.
And so he kind of engaged us as a writer.
Mm-hmm.
You felt like he was talking to you.
Yeah, and then you also you also had these moments, as I was saying earlier, let's say with even the kind of the Planned Parenthood being next door to the Sheen Center, there are these moments where you think, I know he's going to say something about this in the next issue. Mm-hmm. I can't wait to see what he does with that. And I would say, by comparison, that was when he was at his best. I think where things got more challenging for Neuhaus, and I see it in the personal correspondence, is when he became Neuhaus. There's a fantastic essay by the great literary critic Lionel Trilling about what went wrong with Ernest Hemingway in the late 1940s. He called it the Hemingway Problem. And it was this moment where Ernest Hemingway stopped writing novels about people in the world, and he started writing Hemingway novels. He started writing to and from his reputation, and stopped really thinking about what really drove his work earlier. A change with The Old Man and the Sea. There was a time, I would say, in the early 2000s where that started to happen to Neuhaus. And I could track it because Neuhaus had every email he ever wrote filed. Think about the implications of that, everybody, in terms of he knew someone would come along and want to read these. People would begin sending him material, basically. Father Neuhaus, look what my parish priest said. Look at the size of this golden Labrador on the altar. Like, he would give people would send him stuff to kind of, as it were, almost bait him into doing the Neuhaus thing. And he became very frustrated with that because there was more to him than, to be honest, there was more to him than theological gossip, I think, right? I think that's where a more serious sense of him comes in. And where I would see it, and we didn't talk about this just now, but I would say we very much see it at Immaculate Conception. This was the parish on, where's Immaculate Conception? On 14th? On 14th and 1st? From what I can tell, a Filipino majority parish. I went there a few times I went there for Mass, but then I also went there to do research. And I was really amazed by the fact that some of the people who went there clearly knew who Father Neuhaus was and were really engaged and excited that Father Neuhaus was an associate at the parish. And then there were others who had no idea, in a great way. They liked him as Father Neuhaus. Right? He writes some kind of newsletter? I mean, they had no idea because he was their priest. Mm-hmm. And that was more important than First Things, in a sense, right? And that struck me as really important.
Neuhaus, as preacher and public speaker, mm-hmm. I mean, he was a very commanding speaker.
Yes.
What's your sense of that?
Well,
clearly it was born in the. I mean, you could tell when he would come to a group and give a talk, not a sermon, but a talk, that having spent many years in the pulpit, he knew how to craft a public address.
Well, part of it was, of course, the rich depth of his voice.
Oh yeah, right. That's a good point.
He had a voice that would really engage people.
Randy Boyagoda, yes.
That's right, exactly. And it could be nerve-wracking. I was once at a wedding where he was. I only met him a couple of times, and then it was that very thing. It was Randy Boyagoda. Now, why are you here? And it went. I got very nervous. And I had to explain to Father Neuhaus why I got invited to this wedding. Anyway, at one point in his in the 90s, he had written a book, and he was asked to go up to a Barnes and Noble at Midtown. And he went up there for a talk, something along these lines. And if I remember correctly, Davida Goldman, his longtime assistant office manager at First Things,
Still with us?
still, there you go, accompanied him. And this is Barnes & Noble, Midtown Manhattan, probably not expecting what he did, which was he got up and in that very commanding way began speaking. Those who would have known him probably would have known him as, NPR, Meet the Press, Father Neuhaus, public figure. And he more or less preached to them in like the side part of the Barnes & Noble, in between the Clive Cussler and the Harry Potter books or something, because he read the room and realized here are people who otherwise might not engage with these questions this way. But the key in this is what Davida told me. Everything I just said would sound like a train wreck, right? But Neuhaus's skills as a speaker, his command as a speaker, meant that they sat there and they listened and they were engaged. And I think that really does demonstrate just how effective he was as a public presence and a public speaker.
Neuhaus, the mentor, you mentioned his cultivation of young people that would go into church work, and then he inaugurated this Junior Fellows program at First Things and really touched the lives of any number of different people. Some of whom went into religious life, priesthood, some of whom went into publishing, others who went on to academic careers and so on. One of the things that he did, but he was also a kind of team builder, I would call him. So it wasn't just mentoring younger people, but building a team around him for the various things he wanted to accomplish. I mean, Greg Fryer, who's the pastor now at Emmanuel Lutheran Church, told me that there was a pizza night, once a month pizza night for Lutheran pastors, and which he continued after he became a Catholic priest. So his sense of responsibility as a leader, I think was very real.
Well, and I think that sense of responsibility was both as leader, but also as member of a community, of multiple communities. And he maintained that and was an example. I can't tell you the number of people I have met who can point to a moment. There are the major figures that we read in First Things that you continue to work with. That's not that surprising. That would be true, I think, of a lot of people who had objectively the kind of career that Neuhaus had in terms of media and writing and ideas, etc. But the number of younger people and academics who can point out to me a moment of contact with Neuhaus where and the point wasn't, congratulations, you met Richard John Neuhaus. Rather, it was encouraging them to go out and live out their vocations, especially those who were writers. I think that has been decisive for a lot of people. And I think he saw that as very much part of his vocation.
Neuhaus, the Catholic, I mean, he had a role in the Catholic Church. He was a figure, and as you said, much admired and also, in some circles, loathed.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember once but before I knew anything, I was at a conference. I'm an English professor by training at the University of Toronto. I was a graduate student. I was at a conference in the early 2000s somewhere while I was a graduate student. I was reading First Things magazine, not really yet knowing what that meant. And I ran into an older Jesuit academic. You know how this story ends. And and I just said, I realized that we had something in common. And then I just said something along the lines of, "Oh, I'm reading this magazine. Have you heard of this? First Things? Richard John Neuhaus?" And then he just says, "I wish he'd convert back." And so I think there was a sense that Neuhaus, the Catholic, in the public context, was very much a force to be reckoned with. I think probably reaching a high water point by the late 90s, if we think about Neuhaus's rather direct engagement and contact with John Paul II, in parallel, in limited ways, less than, let's say, the New York Review of Books would think, but in limited but still real ways with the Bush presidency. Both the lead up to, where phrases like a culture of life came
to George W. Bush directly from Richard John Neuhaus. I think there was a lot of anxiety about that, but then I think there was also just a recognition, that this is what he was contributing. I mean, the beauty, I think, of Catholicism is its capaciousness, and I think Neuhaus understood to some degree the role he was playing in a larger story. He played it very well. He played it aggressively. He played it successfully, not always. And I think the people around him, I'm just thinking about, let's say, Peter Steinfels and Commonweal, and then the sort of back and forth over years, if not decades, between them. But certainly with animosity, certainly on the page, but I think a mutual sense of appreciation, at least for the effort and the seriousness of the effort. I'll just say one other thing about Neuhaus as Catholic. In the 80s, Neuhaus was very close to Cardinal John O'Connor. This was over in their shared commitment to the pro-life movement, and that
He would regularly drink scotch late into the night with Cardinal O'Connor on Friday nights, as I recall.
Well, there you go. And I think that predates, of course, the conversion, right? And so I think he had an interest, and this is also ecclesial, his understanding specifically of Lutheranism, and even the liturgical mode that he pursued was very, very Catholic in a lot of ways. So I would argue there was a lifelong interest in Catholicism that only became kind of public and formalized by 1990.
Well, his mentor in Carl Arthur Piepkorn in seminary he represented a strand of Lutheranism, which is the minority strand, that sees Lutheranism as a reform movement within the Church Catholic.
Correct. And part of what made Neuhaus's seminary experience in St. Louis at Concordia so intense was a kind of intellectual vocational awakening that came of his being mentored by Piepkorn. But at the same time, Piepkorn, as you say, Rusty, represented a minority strain within Missouri that was fighting very much a majority strain influenced far more by fundamentalist Christianity, far more of an interest in the Bible, in a kind of sola scriptura, as it were, and a rejection of the idea that Lutheranism is a reform movement internal to the Church Catholic. And the Piepkorn side lost pretty decisively. And Neuhaus kind of left with that sense both of conflict, which continued on through the 70s and the 80s, continues on probably to this day in some ways in Lutheranism. But the ecclesial formation, Piepkorn would send Neuhaus and others to a Catholic parish on Sunday mornings for study, as it were, just to see liturgy, as it were.
Right. I think he told me that when he would explain to his mother why he was entering the Catholic Church, he would explain his reasons about the church has this, and the church this, and the church this, and she would say, "Yes, Richard, I know, but why I know, but why, isn't that what the Missouri Synod is?"
Exactly.
So that high sense of
Yes.
the church was very characteristic of the Missouri Synod, although Piepkorn interpreted it in a far more liturgical
Yes, that's right.
fashion. Neuhaus, the friend, his most important friends.
I think his most important friends would be Robert Louis Wilkin, whom I'd mentioned earlier. Certainly George Weigel, probably known to many of you here. George and Neuhaus were friends from the late 70s onward, especially so thereafter. Family friends, cottage friends, collaborators, obviously, on the First Things Project and also in Washington.
They were
and
both
Rome.
raconteurs.
Yeah, that's right. They both like to tell the story. So I think Weigel was very important. Another, the late Peter Berger, very important to Neuhaus. Berger was, of course, a sociologist, very influential sociologist, and Neuhaus and Berger collaborated from the late 60s onwards on a lot of books and a lot of intellectual projects. They had a falling out by the mid-90s over the end of democracy issue of First Things magazine.
Also, I think Peter felt acutely Richard's departure from Lutheranism.
Yeah, I think you're right.
And felt that was something of a betrayal.
Yes, I don't know this in personal terms, but I had a sense that Berger's was a more intellectual, cultural commitment to Lutheranism.
The Protestantism went very deep in Peter Berger.
Yes, but I think he wouldn't. He might not have been as drawn to, let's say, the ecclesiastical commitments that drew Neuhaus towards Catholicism, perhaps. But Wilkin, Weigel, Berger, those three very much come to mind. I think Father Raymond de Souza, a Canadian priest, in later years was very important to Neuhaus because I think Father Raymond very much saw his own vocation develop under
Avery Dulles?
Yeah, very much so. Avery Dulles, the Jesuit theologian, was a great friend and collaborator. Rabbi David Novak, Rabbi Abraham Heschel, both of them at different points in Neuhaus's career were great friends and collaborators. There's a lot of people like that.
How would you characterize the achievement?
I would characterize the achievement by thinking about the frequency with which I hear the phrase religion in the public square. I think Neuhaus has the more interesting one suddenly immediately is the world within worlds, on New York billboards, as it were. But I think Neuhaus gave us a vocabulary for thinking about the relationship between faith and public life, religion's place in public life. Whether you agree with him or disagree with him, as it were, you're working within his vocabulary. I think America, if you just listen to NPR, it's become a phrase. If you look at academic work, it's a phrase now. I think in a really deep way that's one of his great achievements. I think the community of First Things magazine is something that Neuhaus very much achieved and made possible. The fact that it is very much thriving under your editorial leadership these days.
One of the things that I found when I travel around and talk to longtime readers, I can't tell you how many times people give me a kind of personal testimony about how the magazine, and especially his column, was so important to them. Many people said, I entered the Catholic Church because of First Things, or evangelicals will say that in college it really saved my faith. So yeah, I think I'm always struck by, there's a kind of charism in the magazine that is very much his charism.
And we can turn to, if it makes sense, we can turn to questions now, but I'll just end on that very point, Rusty, that my own vocation very much came out of reading First Things magazine, and that I suspect this is not an unfamiliar story, ethnic Catholic. My mom smells and bells. When I went to college, she hid Jesus and Mary medals under my bed because I was at an Anglican college. She wanted to keep the Anglican girls away from me. So I grew up in a rich devotional way, but the life of the mind had nothing to do with my faith at all. So that I got to a point in graduate school where I'm reading Derrida and applying Derrida to Faulkner, and then going to church, and there was no way that these two things could speak to each other. And then a priest at a seminary in Toronto where I was, my friend was, it was his uncle, we were visiting him. I told him what I was doing. I'm working on Derrida and Faulkner, and he said, here, read this instead. And he gave me a copy of First Things magazine. And I started reading it, and then I saw open up suddenly a place for integration where faith and ideas do come together in real and serious ways about politics, about economics, about religion, theology, the arts. And I think that became a really important feature for my own discernment of my vocation, which ironically leads to something like this.
All right, let's get some questions from folks, if there are any. Hard to see out there amidst all the lights, but why not?
Okay, there you go.
There we go, perfect. Anybody? Question? Well, Randy, what about...
There we go.
Okay, we got
There we
one.
go.
Okay, good.
I am a recent convert to Roman Catholicism. It's 5 years now, 4 years now. Right? And I was a former Lutheran. I was on the American Lutheran Publicity Bureau, and I used to read Richard John Neuhaus's Lutheran Forum.
Another one.
I read First Things now, by the way.
I mean, that's when he honed his polemical skills.
But I remember reading his book on Catholic matters and going through every page going, yes, yes, yes. And then I read your book in the chapter on his conversion, And there's a period in his life when he finally comes, and this is the first time it came to me, where he said, you know, when you realize that you need full communion with the Catholic Church, you cannot say no, or something to that effect. I was wondering if you could tell me, when did he come to that conclusion? Because I was at the American Lutheran Publicity Bureau meeting in 1990, the first time I ever saw him in civilian clothes. Because he wasn't a Lutheran pastor, he was at the Lutheran Church, but he hadn't yet been accepted into the Catholic Church.
He called it his necktie.
Yeah, it was a necktie, up at the Wartburg home
Yeah.
here in New York. And I'm thinking, at some point he came to the conclusion where when you realize you must have full communion with the Catholic Church, you cannot say no anymore.
I think he was there intellectually by the late 1980s. I think a book like The Catholic Moment really articulates that. Peter Steinfeld, who was then religion editor at the time, said something like, "What's a Lutheran pastor doing, making the strongest possible case for the Catholic Church as the anchor institution of Western civilization today? Where does that come from?" So I think he was there intellectually by the late 80s. And I think also, to be honest, politically he was there as well, and thinking just about the relationship between religion and politics and where things were going. He was very frustrated with Lutheranism and with its kind of Physiparist nature by then. There was, do you remember the St. Olaf conference? 1990, there was a conference at St. Olaf College, which was a kind of a last gasp conference, more or less, for Neuhaus's strain of Lutheranism, like a certain strain within the Missouri Synod, beyond the Missouri Synod at this point.
Yes, ELCA.
ELCA, to make a case for a return to orthodoxy and a certain kind of liturgical seriousness that wasn't necessarily fundamentalist, more than only biblical, as it were, and it didn't work. So I think in ecclesial terms, that was a decisive moment. As for his personal movement, I think that had a lot to do with George Weigel. I think Weigel and Neuhaus spent a lot of time together. In the late 80s, they would spend time at Neuhaus's cottage in Pembroke, Ontario together. And I think there's a lot of late-night conversation happening there that probably spoke to it. Now, famously, he asked for his diaries to be burned upon his death. So I don't know the real moment, but probably in the late 80s, it was happening on those three fronts.
And I wouldn't downplay the sense of responsibility as a pastor who had mentored people in all kinds of ways. So I think as an ordained person within, an ordained person in a non-Catholic context they feel the need they often feel the countervailing pull of that sense of loyalty to the people that they pastor.
Several of my former pastors were at those pizza nights
Yes.
over there on East 19th Street, and I remember the day he announced to them that he was converting. I got a call the next day. It's Neuhaus. And I thought, what's wrong? He said, he's converting. I'm like, well, he's not dead. That was how brave this, because he was the founder of the Evangelical Catholic movement, Lutheranism. And that was really the beginning of the Wende, we would say in German. I'm a historian by trade.
Yeah.
And from there was just...
I'll point to one other thing related to that, and to your point as well, Rusty. One of the Lutheran pastors I interviewed for the biography, who was not a close friend of Neuhaus's, but a kind of longtime associate, expressed, 15 years after the fact, 20 years after the fact, real frustration, even anger, that at Neuhaus's ordination, the word "now" was, "Now you are a priest of the order of Melchizedek." And this pastor felt that fundamentally invalidated every Lutheran pastor in the audience, or in the pews, as it were. And he was so hurt and frustrated by that. Why now? Why now? But it does very much speak to how seriously, and it related to the idea that they had been in this together, as it were, right? They were very much connected and committed. This priest, he might have also converted eventually to Catholicism and become a priest, if I'm not mistaken. But there was a sense of how seriously a non-Catholic pastor took those vows and what they meant in a larger context. Other questions?
Sorry, how there next, if that's right. Yes, go ahead, and then you.
I've had a subscription to National Review since the 70s, and I first became familiar with Neuhaus through his column in National Review. And I was wondering did Bill Buckley have any effect on him becoming a Catholic?
that's a very good question. They were very friendly. Neuhaus showed up on firing line a few times. They would visit in personal terms. In my research, I didn't see them discussing Catholicism itself a lot. I think their intersections had more to do with conservative magazine culture. Maybe the most important collaboration to my mind that they had was basically after Neuhaus broke with Rockford. It was in the late 80s, or 89, 90. There was a Future of Conservatism conference organized, and Buckley and Neuhaus together picked the guest list. And there was a kind of mutual sense that we're going to decide who's in and who's out now. And I think that was more than Catholicism, I think. That was where maybe they had serious things together. Sir, you had your hand up.
To follow up, where did Cardinal O'Connor come in the picture? Did Neuhaus seek him out? Was it just because he was in New York, or were there other Catholic priests or bishops that brought him along, so to speak?
To some degree, one could just sort of imagine what happens when kind of outsized magnetism finds outsized magnetism, right? Like, when you're in a room, you can just tell two people are going to just eventually find each other. I suspect for some reason they would have found each other that way, but it was pro-life commitments. Neuhaus, I think Cardinal O'Connor convened some kind of ecumenical group committed to ending abortion in maybe the early to mid 80s, early 80s maybe. No, it was that. But then also it was also John Paul II's visit to New York. Was it early 80s that John Paul came to New York? 79. Would O'Connor have been? No, he wouldn't have been. Okay, so it's okay. Now I'm remembering. I've only reread this 3 times today, but it was the pro-life commitment. But then also chutzpah. O'Connor was at Scranton, wasn't he, before he came? But Neuhaus took the liberty of writing a note to O'Connor while he was at Scranton, saying, "It's really great. Basically, you've been in the AAA team. Now you're coming to Yankee Stadium. We should meet so I can give you some media training." And I think O'Connor got a kick out of that. And then they met, and then in more practical terms, it was pro-life. It was pro-life related. But yeah, I think that was again part of it. One other, just because. Neuhaus and chutzpah. He famously had then Cardinal Ratzinger come to New York to give a talk as part of a First Things event.
No, it was before First Things.
Before First Things, you're right. That was mid-80s.
A couple years
mid-80s.
before, 87.
87. And they were going back and forth on the topic. Back and forth. And Ratzinger wanted to discuss, I think, biblical hermeneutics, if I'm not mistaken. And Neuhaus wanted to talk about his most recent book, Neuhaus' own most recent book. And he proposed as much to Ratzinger. Why don't we discuss the Catholic moment? Or whatever the book was right before
Probably
that.
Catholic moment, right? I think it makes sense in
And
terms of
Ratzinger's
timing.
response was, we will discuss biblical hermeneutics. Full stop. Other questions? Yeah, at the back, Father.
The impact of John Courtney Murray on Neuhaus's view of the public square?
That is a more fraught question. You're mentioning a very important book called We Hold These Truths, which John Courtney Murray published mid to late 60s, if I'm not mistaken, which was notable at the time as an American effort to make a case for Catholicism's compatibility with democracy. And in chatting with some serious political theorists who care about religion and politics, they would argue that was kind of the original and still permanently substantive contribution to this question, that really did create the context. And Neuhaus did a fantastic job of popularizing it, but the core ideas that we find in The Naked Public Square found their first iteration in We Hold These Truths. And I think Weigel told me that he was the one who actually introduced Neuhaus to that book, if I'm not mistaken. But probably objectively, that's where it really happened.
Two very quick questions. One, given where we are, was there ever any documented interaction between Father Neuhaus and Fulton Sheen? And then, given the maxim that politics is downstream from culture, given his cultured intellect, did the arts play any role
We were talking about this before.
in his conversion?
I'll speak to just to that first one. He certainly knew of Fulton Sheen. I don't think they ever had any who didn't know Fulton Sheen. I think probably growing up in America in the second half of the 20th century. I think he saw him certainly as a model of something, but I don't think there was any real direct contact there. Neuhaus in the arts, Rusty?
You know, he you could tell by his art collection. I mean, when you go to his townhouse or in the offices of First Things, that his interest in the visual arts kind of petered out in the early 1970s. So there's a definite dated quality to a lot of his what was on his walls.
A lot of macrame Jesus.
He
I
was
guess you could say.
he was a founder and a board member of a small little fund that was operated out of the Presbyterian Church on Fifth Avenue north of Washington Square Park that provided small grants to people to put on theatrical productions that would typically explore Christian themes. But, you know, he was not, he loved Bach, but he didn't go to concerts.
Can I just speak to that? That was actually one of Robert Louis Wilkins' beefs with Neuhaus, in a very friendly way. They were longtime, very good friends. But Wilkin was down in Virginia, and he would come visit often enough. And he was always trying to go to the opera and kind of go enjoy that part of what makes New York so remarkable.
He likes, Robert likes jazz.
And that Neuhaus wasn't interested in this. Neuhaus had no desire
talk.
for it. Yeah, he wanted to talk. He didn't want to
his
listen.
happiest times were, as Randy says, I spent many biblious evenings in 338 in his living room, and he just loved to talk about stuff. And he didn't. I mean, as you said, he he's a great talker, and he could hold forth, but he was interested in what other people had to say. I mean, he wanted to think things through and hear what you had to say, and and nothing would disappoint him more than having interlocutors that weren't pushing him, because he certainly pushed.
Yeah.
So he liked the crossing of swords in conversation.
And that's what you really felt in First Things magazine at its best, right? You could really feel that sense of a lively conversation.
I mean, he had a grand piano or a baby grand piano in his living room that was just completely out of tune. So it was clear no one was playing that piano. But maybe that was part of what it meant to be a Lutheran pastor. You had to have a piano in your living room.
Perhaps time for one more question. Anybody else? Is there a hand over there?
Just pursuant to the previous one, can you speak about his interactions with Judaism and other faiths, given that New York is such a multicultural city and was back then as well?
Very much so. It was very important to him in the 60s. Starting in the 60s. In national terms, this had to do with Abraham Heschel, who was a leading figure, of course, in American public life in the 60s, especially when it came to the civil rights movement. He was one of Neuhaus's most decisive mentors. And I would say that after Peepcorn, when Neuhaus moved to New York, Heschel became really a kind of, I would say in some ways, an intellectual / public-minded father figure for him. In Brooklyn, in that part of Brooklyn in Williamsburg, was a very strong Satmar. If that makes sense? I'm forgetting for a moment. A Satmar Jewish
version
community?
of Hasidic Judaism.
Yes,
Satmar.
a very intense community of Satmar Jews living in that part of Brooklyn.
They still do.
And Neuhaus was intensely drawn to them as a model precisely because they were living in Brooklyn and because they were living out their faith in such a confident way in the midst of an otherwise kind of secular, falling apart urban landscape. That really spoke to him. He was a very close collaborator with Rabbi and Professor David Novak over the course of his career. He wrote for commentary a lot. He fought with commentary now and then. And then there was this key moment. Politically, sure. Intellectually, yes. But there was a key moment where Heschel pushed him once. They were having a conversation over the question of conversion, and it became a kind of a moment where Heschel was really pushing him on the question of the Christian call to convert, and whether he basically said, Richard, you find our faith so full and beautiful, and you're always telling me this. So logically, though, do you really want me to abandon all of this for Christianity? And Neuhaus said no. He in a direct way, but Heschel pushed him there. But there was a deep respect for Judaism throughout his career, personally, intellectually, and I think also in religious terms.
And I think it also was part of this kind of crucial moment in the 60s and 70s. It was a time of a lot of ecumenical energy and commitment. So Una Sancta, the journal that he was, I think, editor of, as they founded, was an ecumenical journal. And so the interreligious and the ecumenical were just part of this wide commitment on the part of many people, including him.
Well, like to, now the lights are on, I can see who's here. Your Excellency and Bishop Barris, thank you so much. We are so honored to have you with us tonight. But most of all, I want to thank Randy and Rusty. The integration that you talk about, that first things first provided you of faith and reason coming together, and through the performing arts, faith and beauty, that's what First Things does. That's what we're trying to do here in the Sheen Center. That's where the church needs to be that voice in the public square. So again, Randy, thank you very much. After 5 years, I'm glad we could have you. Rusty.
Have you all been sitting here for 5 years?
Yes. Rusty, thank you very much. I wish everyone here in advance a blessed rest of the Advent season and an early Merry Christmas. Thank you very much. And thank you, gentlemen, very much for being here.